There's a specific kind of silence that only exists inside the cab of a long-haul rig when the sun's been down for 10 hours and the rain is turning the world into a gray, blurred memory. You'd think the engine would be loud enough to drown it out, but it isn't. You can feel the silence sitting in the passenger seat, heavy and expectant, just waiting for you to blink long enough for it to take the wheel. I was crossing the Cascades, hauling 40,000 pounds of refrigerated meat. The road was a winding ribbon of black glass, and the rain was coming down in sheets that made my headlights feel useless. I was pushing my hours. I knew that. My eyes were burning. That grit behind the eyeballs feeling that tells you your brain is starting to misfire. Then the high beams caught a flash of white on the shoulder. It wasn't a deer. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still in the downpour, wearing a floral Sunday dress that looked soaked through to her skin. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't have a coat. She was just holding a small wicker picnic basket and waving. A slow, rhythmic motion of her hand, like she was greeting a neighbor over a white picket fence. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had, every story I'd heard over the CB radio for 20 years, told me to keep my foot on the gas. But she looked so much like my own mother, small, frail, with white hair plastered to her skull by the storm. I hit the air brakes. The rig hissed and groaned as it came to a stop a few yards ahead of her. I opened the door, and the cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine and wet earth. "Ma'am," I shouted over the rain, "what are you doing out here? You're gonna freeze." She didn't answer right away. She climbed up the steps with a surprising, jerky quickness, her movements like a bird's. When she sat in the passenger seat, she didn't shiver. She just set that wicker basket on her lap and smoothed out her wet dress. "I'm going to the bridge, dear," she said. Her voice was thin and high, like wind whistling through a cracked window. "Just a little further up the road. You're such a kind boy to stop for an old woman." I pulled back onto the road, my heart thumping a bit too fast. I tried to make small talk, the way you do to keep yourself awake. I asked her where she lived, if she had family nearby. She just kept staring straight through the windshield, her hands clutching the handle of that basket. Her knuckles were white, not just pale, but the color of bleached bone. "My boys are waiting for me at the bridge," she whispered. "They're so hungry. It's been a long season, and the cellar is empty." I looked over at her, and that's when I noticed the first thing that was truly wrong. The heater was blasting at full strength. My cab was probably 75 degrees, but the water on her dress wasn't drying. In fact, it wasn't even dripping off her. It was pulsing. The wet floral fabric seemed to be moving, shifting against her skin as if something underneath was trying to find a way out. And then there was the smell. It hit me all at once. It wasn't the smell of rain. It was the smell of a stagnant pond. It was the scent of something that had been underwater for a very, very long time. "Are you all right, ma'am?" I asked, my hand drifting toward the door handle. She turned her head to look at me. She didn't turn it like a person does. Her shoulders stayed perfectly still, but her neck twisted nearly 90 degrees with a sound like dry sticks snapping. She wasn't wearing a floral dress. As my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the dashboard, I realized the flowers on the fabric were actually hundreds of tiny, translucent moths, their wings pinned to her gray, bloated skin. They were shivering in unison, creating the illusion of a pattern. "We're almost there, Caleb," she said. "My name isn't Caleb." I opened my mouth to tell her that, but my throat felt like it was filled with silt. "The bridge is just around the bend," she continued. She began to open the wicker basket on her lap. "Would you like to see what I brought for my boys? They've been waiting for a driver just like you, someone with a big heart, a big beating heart." She reached into the basket and pulled out a rusted set of heavy-duty sewing needles and a spool of what looked like human hair. I looked back at the road, terrified. But the road was gone. The asphalt had turned into a narrow wooden pier that stretched out into a black, bottomless lake. My headlights didn't hit trees or guardrails anymore. They just hit an endless rising mist. I slammed on the brakes, but the pedal went straight to the floor. The rig wasn't stopping, it was accelerating. The old woman leaned over, her face stretching, the skin on her cheeks tearing open to reveal rows of needle-thin teeth. She didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a deep-sea nightmare that had crawled into a dress. "Don't struggle, dear," she hissed, bringing the long needle up to my face. "I need to stitch your eyes shut first. My boys don't like it when the cargo looks back at them." The last thing I saw before the needle pierced the skin of my eyelid was the bridge. It wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was made of dozens of rusted semi-trucks, piled one on top of the other, forming a path into the dark, and they were all empty. There's a stretch of Interstate 80 in Nebraska that truckers call the Black Hole. It's a 60-mile span where the cell towers vanish, the GPS spins in circles, and the radio dial becomes a graveyard of white noise and static. Usually you just pop in a podcast or a CD and white-knuckle it until you see the lights of the next flying J. But last night, the static started to change. I was hauling a dry van of electronics, pushing through a thick, freezing drizzle. I had the radio on low, just for the company of the noise. When the sharp hiss of the static smoothed out, it turned into a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy heart beating inside the dashboard. I reached over to turn the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The digital display was stuck on 0.0 FM. That's impossible. Radios don't start at 0. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't a DJ or a weather report. It was the voice of an old woman. It was sweet, trembling, and sounded exactly like my grandmother used to sound when she was reading me a bedtime story. Warm, but with a strange, underlying coldness that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Welcome back to the long haul, Elias," she said. "My name is Elias. You're making good time tonight. Too good, perhaps. You should slow down. The bridge at mile marker 114 is feeling brittle." Pause. I let off the accelerator. My heart was hammered against my ribs. There was no way a local station knew my name. There was no way a broadcast was targeting my specific rig. I grabbed the CB mic, ready to ask if anyone else was hearing this, but the CB was dead. No hiss, no chatter, just silence. "Don't bother with the radio, dear." The old woman's voice came back, clearer now. "Nobody can hear you but me. I'm the one who keeps the records. I'm the one who counts the miles." Then I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was the sound of a tea kettle whistling and the slow, rhythmic creak, creak, creak of a rocking chair. It sounded like she was sitting right there in the sleeper berth behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back of the cab was dark, but for a split second, I saw the glow of a radio dial reflected in a pair of glasses. A pair of glasses that weren't mine. "I have a request tonight," she continued. "A song for a man who didn't check his brake lines in Cheyenne. A song for a man who thinks he's alone in the dark." Suddenly, the speakers didn't play music. They played the sound of a metal-on-metal collision, the screech of tearing steel, the sound of glass shattering in slow motion. And over the top of it, the old woman began to hum, a low, tuneless melody that vibrated through the steering wheel. I looked at the digital clock on the dash. It was counting backward. 3:14, 3:13, 3:12. "Do you want to see the studio, Elias?" she asked. Her voice dropped an octave, losing that grandmotherly sweetness. It became raspy, like sand being poured over wet meat. "It's just over the next rise. Look to your left, the house with the red porch light." I looked. In the middle of a barren cornfield, where there shouldn't have been anything for miles, sat a tiny, dilapidated shack. A single red bulb burned on the porch. Standing under that light was the old woman. She wasn't holding a microphone. She was holding a heavy, old-fashioned telephone handset, and the cord went straight into the ground. She was staring at my truck as I flew past at 70 miles per hour. Even at that distance, I could see her mouth moving in perfect sync with the words coming out of my speakers. "You missed your exit, Elias," she hissed. The radio display suddenly changed. It didn't say 0.0 anymore. It said ETA 0001. I looked back at the road, and my headlights hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was my own truck, not a truck like mine. It was my rig, with my license plate flipped over in the middle of the highway, wheels still spinning. The radio gave one final, wet cackle. "Don't worry, dear," the old woman whispered, her voice now coming from the speaker directly behind my left ear. "I'll stay on the air with you all the way down." I slammed on the brakes, but the cab didn't slow. I felt the steering wheel go limp in my hands. The world began to tilt. The radio started playing the sound of my own screaming, recorded and looped over and over again. There is a wall you hit when you've been behind the wheel for 24 hours straight. Your vision starts to fray at the edges like an old VHS tape. The white lines on the road start to look like silver snakes slithering under your tires, and the hum of the engine stops being a sound and starts being a conversation. I was hauling a load of dry goods through the Nebraska Panhandle. My logbook was a work of fiction, and my eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. I knew I should pull over, but every rest stop I passed was either full or boarded up. Then, just as the clock hit the 25th hour of wakefulness, I saw it. Pearl's Pit Stop, home cooking for the long haul. The neon sign was a vibrant, pulsing pink that seemed to cut right through the fog. It wasn't on my GPS. It wasn't on the paper map tucked in the door pocket. It just appeared, nestled in a valley that had been empty darkness seconds before. I pulled the rig in. The parking lot was paved with gravel that didn't crunch when I drove over it. It was silent, dead silent. There were 3 other rigs parked there, old models, the kind with round headlights and rusted chrome that you don't see on the road anymore. I climbed out of the cab. The air didn't smell like the plains. It smelled like Sunday dinner, pot roast, mashed potatoes, and cinnamon. It was a smell so thick it felt like I was breathing in a blanket. I pushed open the glass door of the diner. A bell chimed, but the sound didn't ring. It just thudded and died. "Well, look at you," a voice said. Behind the counter stood an old woman. She was tiny, with a beehive of snow-white hair and an apron that was so clean it looked like it was glowing. She was Pearl. She had a smile that reminded me of my favorite aunt, but her eyes were different. They were the color of a bruised plum, and they didn't seem to have pupils. "You look tuckered out, Caleb," she said. I didn't even bother correcting her about my name. I was too tired to care. I sat down on a swivel stool. The vinyl was warm, as if someone had just left, but the diner was empty. "I just need coffee, Pearl. Black, strong enough to melt the spoon," I muttered. She chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, no coffee, honey. Not for you. You've done enough work. What you need is a big plate of my special rest-easy stew and a nice long nap in the back room." She set a bowl in front of me. It was steaming, smelling of rich beef and herbs. I picked up the spoon, but as I moved to take a bite, I noticed something. The steam wasn't rising, it was falling. It was flowing over the edges of the bowl and pooling on the counter like a heavy gas. I looked around the diner again. On the far wall, there was a row of those missing person flyers you see at every truck stop. I squinted. The faces on the flyers weren't strangers. They were the drivers of the 3 rusted rigs sitting out in the lot. And in the very last slot, there was a fresh flyer. It was a picture of me. Not a grainy photo, but a clear, high-definition shot of me sitting right here at this counter, looking at the flyer. "Eat up, Caleb," Pearl whispered. She was leaning over the counter now. Her skin was starting to sag, sliding off her cheekbones like melting wax. "The boys in the back are getting lonely. They haven't had a new story to listen to in years." I dropped the spoon. It didn't clatter. It sank into the counter as if the wood had turned into quicksand. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like they were made of water. I looked down at my hands. They were turning gray. The color was draining out of my skin and flowing into the floorboards. Pearl reached across and took my hand. Her touch wasn't skin on skin. It felt like cold, wet paper. "You're so tired, aren't you?" she cooed. Her mouth opened, and I realized she didn't have any teeth, just rows of jagged, calcified ridges. "Just close your eyes. The road is gone. The load is delivered. You're home now." I looked toward the back of the diner, where a heavy velvet curtain hung over a doorway. The curtain moved, and a hand reached out. It was a human hand, but it was translucent, and the fingernails had been replaced with rusted sewing needles. I realized then that the stew wasn't food. I looked into the bowl and saw a single human eye staring back at me from the gravy. It blinked. It was the same color as mine. I found a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. I lunged backward, falling off the stool. The moment my back hit the floor, the diner vanished. I wasn't in a diner. I was sitting in the middle of the highway, my truck idling 50 yards away, half rolled into a ditch. There was no neon sign, no gravel lot, just the empty howling wind of the Nebraska plains. But as I scrambled back to my rig, my heart hammering in my throat, I reached into my pocket for my keys. My hand hit something cold and wet. I pulled it out. It was a sprig of fresh parsley, dripping with a thick, savory brown gravy that smelled exactly like pot roast. And from the darkness of the cornfield to my left, I heard a thin, high-pitched cackle. "Come back soon, Caleb. You still owe me for the bowl."